this was actually an antidote to the anthropocentrism of anthropology. This was just what the doctor ordered. Anthropologist focuses on anthropos, the human, and here the message was, open your mind up to the other species too. Okay, so I learned, this confirmed what the Ashanic had said. You can take ayahuasca with a trained practitioner and learn things. I learned that I was puny, but part of nature. Okay, well that was interesting. At the same time, how was I going to return to my university and hope to have my professors and colleagues take me seriously? The shadow of Carlos Castaneda flew over my budding career, and I chickened out, turned my back on this mystery, and did another 12 months of field work studying the Ashaninka's rational uses of the rainforest, then returned to university, wrote a dissertation which hardly mentions ayahuasca, and became a doctor in anthropology. Well, the Ashaninka taught me quite a few things, some of which took years to sink in, but one thing that I learned quickly from them was this idea that practice is the most advanced form of theory. In their view, if an idea is good, you can actually do something with it. Otherwise, it's just pura teoria. In other words, not worth much. So I thought, okay, well, if I've learned anything about indigenous Amazonian reality, I want it to be applicable or useful to the people whom it concerns first. So I got a job working for a Swiss NGO called Nouvelle Planet to coordinate between indigenous Amazonian organizations and ecological foundations here in Europe. The idea being that indigenous Amazonian people are the only people who know how to use the rainforest productively without destroying it, who know how to use it rationally, in fact. And so if you want to save the rainforest, one of the best ways of going about doing this is working with indigenous organizations so that indigenous territories are efficiently demarcated and granted land titles. So I started doing this work in 1989, and to this day, this particular work has led to the titling of 40,000 square kilometers of indigenous territories for indigenous communities across the Amazon. This is about 1% of the overall rainforest area. And during this work, I've had the privilege of returning to the Amazon dozens of times and meeting dozens of different indigenous people from different societies, not just Ashaninka, Witoto, Bora, Awaku, Shipibo, Matsigenka, Shawi, etc. And during these trips, I'd be pretty well received because I wasn't just an anthropologist coming to extract data. I was actually the fellow who sent funds so that the territory could be titled, and then I was checking if the work had been done. So I'd get a kind of a red carpet treatment, and there'd be a party, and this would be in these lost valleys in this huge area, as big as Europe. So I'd go up these lost valleys, and we'd go through the party, and by the time the midnight hour would come, I'd bring out my pet question. So, how do you all know what you know about plants? Oh, well, we have our ayahuasqueros, tabaqueros. They take their plant mixtures, and in their visions, they speak with the essences or spirits, common to all life forms, and give them the information. Okay? You've written that down on your little book? Yeah, I've written it down on my notebook, but what's it mean? So here was a mystery. Here are people living in the most biologically diverse place on Earth. Their knowledge about plants is widely recognized by science and industry. And they say that a good part of their knowledge comes from the hallucinations of their shamans. What could this mean? Exactly. In 1992, I went to Rio, the Earth Summit, and everybody was talking about the knowledge of indigenous people, in particular indigenous Amazonian people, saying how important this knowledge was for biodiversity and sustainable development, but nobody was talking about the hallucinatory origin of part of this knowledge as the indigenous people themselves were talking about it. So that experience prompted me to start looking for common ground between indigenous knowledge and Western science. And from 1993 to 1995, I researched that common ground and wrote a book called The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge, which has just been published in Dutch. And it lays out the commonalities between Amazonian shamanism and molecular biology, and in particular between the essences common to all life forms perceived by shamans and DNA, the informational molecule contained at the heart of each cell of each living being. I wrote that book as an anthropologist and as a political activist in favor of indigenous Amazonian people. My mind had been opened by my experience with Ayahuasca shamanism, which had showed me a world filled with information that is ordinarily hidden from view. Ayahuasca impacted on my anthropology by making me take seriously what the indigenous people said, made me listen more closely, made me work, like Francois suggested, on becoming aware of the bias of my own rationalist culture to be able to better understand what people were actually talking about. It also made me less centered on human beings and more open to other species. And finally, it made me want to act as a kind of diplomat between systems of knowledge. Shamans have long talked about intelligence in nature, intelligence of plants and animals. And science now confirms this with recent studies of even the simplest organisms. From 2001 to 2004, I investigated intelligence in nature by traveling to labs from Scotland to Japan and interviewing scientists who study amoebas, plants, and bees. The point was to attempt to validate indigenous systems of knowledge by anthropologizing science. And I published an account of this investigation in 2005 in a book called Intelligence in Nature. But what I'd like to do with the time remaining here today is to tell you about my latest work bringing together Western science and Ayahuasca shamanism. In 1999, I tested the hypothesis presented in The Cosmic Serpent for the first time. This hypothesis states that biomolecular information can be obtained in visions orchestrated by an indigenous shaman. So in 1999, I accompanied 3 molecular biologists to the Peruvian